הולך מעמנו. Welcome, everyone. I'm just admitting one last person. Welcome, everyone. I'm Chris Kellogg, Director of Aging Services at Jewish Family and Children's Jewish Family Services of St. Paul. And I want to welcome you to This Loss is Different, Facing the High Holidays and the Loss of a Loved One in the Time of COVID. Before we begin, I do want to thank our sponsors, which is Jewish Family Children's Service of Minneapolis, Shalom Alliance, the Minnesota Rabbinical Association, the Jewish Chaplains of the Twin Cities, Hadref Epstein Memorial Chapel, and the Minnesota Cantors Association. I just want to say a few words about Zoom before we start. I want to suggest that if you'd like to maximize your experience tonight, you can click on the speaker view. And during the evening, I'll be highlighting the different speakers, so they should show up on your screen in full view. And towards the end of the program, we will be using the chat function, which I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but it's down. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll find it kind of in the middle of that bar. So our first speaker tonight is Sarah Wellington, who is a mental health therapist at Jewish Family Service, and I'm going to turn it over to her.
Okay. All right, that looks like it's working. I want to start out by just saying thank you for joining us tonight. I'm sorry that it's likely a loss has brought you to this event, but we're happy that you're here. And for some of you, this loss might be very recent and fresh. For others, it might be something that you've been living with for months or even years. But I hope that you'll find something helpful to take away from this program. I was asked to talk about the journey of grief following a loss, and this might be information that you've heard before, but what makes it so unique, as we all know, is because it's occurring during COVID-19. So first I want to just talk about how grief looks different during the pandemic, and kind of create a context. So, whether we're aware of it or not, we're all experiencing numerous non-death losses right now due to the pandemic. So some are pretty obvious, like the loss of a job, loss of finances, loss of daily conveniences, changes in living situations or daily routines. Then there are some more subtle losses, like the loss of sense of safety or the loss of sense of freedom to move around as you want. Loss of predictability or inability to change, make plans for the future. And then there are some losses like going shopping or entertainment, going on vacations, socializing. These might not be recognized as losses because they feel more like indulgences, but that doesn't mean they aren't just as important. And in fact, these can become pretty big losses as they're kind of our common way of coping with stress and anxiety. So everybody's affected by the pandemic and experiencing these losses. Some obviously are going to feel bigger than others, but it's this layer upon layer of losses that make it so challenging. So I just want to keep this in mind, that we kind of have this mess of losses as our foundation, and then we're piling on a really big loss of a loved one on top of everything. So inevitably, the process is going to look different. I know that Rabbi Davis and Rabbi Lieberman are going to talk about how the traditions and rituals are affected by COVID, but I want to talk about how the mourning process in general is looking different. So right now, the loss of a loved one during the pandemic is considered a complicated loss. And just as it sounds, complicated loss means that it's more complex and may lead to further issues down the road if it's not addressed. And if the loss was related to COVID, it's considered complicated simply due to the traumatic nature of the death. But it's also considered complicated because for most people, their inability to be present with a loved one, whether it was leading up to the death or at the time of death or at a burial, not being able to be present for those things make it much harder to comprehend the loss and come to terms with it. And it's also considered complicated because of the multiple losses that I was just mentioning. These non-death losses just magnify the loss. So for example, you might feel more angry or more regret because you weren't actually able to spend time with your loved one just in a normal way leading up to months of their death. So I think it's really important to identify all these extra layers of complications so that they can be tended to and supported. Another reason why grieving is looking so different is understandably because we have to keep away from each other. The loss of a loved one is already isolating, but even more so people are feeling alone. Most notably because you aren't able to get the in-person support that you would usually get, which is such an important aspect of grieving. But also you might feel like the grief is not recognized by others because they are so consumed with their own losses and the stressors that are related to the pandemic. Another reason is that people might feel just the decrease of activities that they're experiencing. You have more time to think about the loss. And we also have all this daily news that we're bombarded with that is referencing illnesses and deaths. And when you already experienced a loss, you don't want to have extra constant reminders of death. So needless to say, the pandemic is making an already painful and challenging time much more difficult by orders of magnitude. And I'm going to talk about the grieving process, and then later we're going to talk about ways to kind of help cope with all of this given the unusual circumstances. When people hear grieving process, I think they often think of the emotional side. They think of the sadness, possibly depression or anger, but it's more complex. It's more than just emotions. It's also the physical and cognitive and behavioral changes. So I want to spend a little bit of time on these just to normalize what you might be experiencing, but also to give an idea of how varied what I consider the symptoms of grief can look like. So there are common feelings that come to mind: shock, sadness, anger, guilt, anxiety, loneliness. But then some that are a little less obvious, like fatigue, a sense of helplessness, the yearning to be with the person, or even a sense of numbness, or in some cases a sense of relief. Then there are physical sensations. So it could be a tightness in your chest or your throat, or like a hollowness in your stomach, oversensitivity to things like noise, or a sense of depersonalization, like you're walking around in a dream and everything is surreal. Things like shortness of breath, weakness of muscles, lack of energy, even dry mouth are all sensations that people may experience. Changes in cognition, so disbelief, confusion, preoccupation, also a sense of presence, like the feeling like the person who died is still with you. And then we have changes in behavior, so kind of the more obvious, crying, trouble sleeping, changes in appetite, social withdrawal, but also lots of dreams about the person who passed away, absent-mindedness, either avoiding reminders of the person that passed or carrying treasured objects or things that they had with you, wearing their clothes, restlessness, or constantly visiting a place that maybe they loved. So I know that's kind of a long list and it's certainly not exhaustive, but I just want to give you a sense of the range that you can feel grief in different ways. It's likely one person isn't going to experience all of these, and some people might just experience a few. And I'm sure you've all heard before, grief looks different for everybody. Everybody's going to grieve in their own way. And it's also important to keep in mind that each loss is going to be grieved in a different way, depending on the importance of the relationship with the person that you lost. There are lots of theories and approaches to kind of understanding the phases of mourning. Some are more well known than others, but they share a lot of the same common concepts. And I wanted to talk about one that I think is most helpful for me. I like that this one talks about different tasks. It focuses on grief as something that we participate in and not just something that happens to us. So for the first task, you're challenged with accepting the reality of the loss. And so often when somebody dies, it's really hard to comprehend that they're actually gone. You might be looking for them, feeling their presence, calling out for them. As I mentioned before, keeping possessions around you or keeping their room in order as if they might return. It's important to note that this acceptance needs to be both on an intellectual and emotional level. So it's complicated and it takes a lot of time. And in relation to our topic tonight, traditions and rituals are particularly helpful for this stage of the process. So that's why we're going to be spending a lot of time on that. The second task is processing the pain of grief. It's important to realize that this isn't just the emotional pain, but there can be physical pain too. And we live in a society that often tries to distract people away from pain in a way that we think will help them feel better. But in reality, that really doesn't serve us well. It's not a stage that can be sped through or skipped. And I'll talk later about why it's important to feel the pain and also some ways to help manage it and work through it. The third task is adjusting to the world without the loved one. So there's kind of three kinds of adjustment. There's the external adjustment, and that is the question of, how does my world look different now that this person is no longer with me? Especially if it's somebody that you interact with every day, like a partner, this can take a really long time. For some people, it might be that they have to learn how to do things that their partner used to do for them. Then there's the internal adjustments, and that's more of a change in a sense of identity or a sense of self. So the question of who am I now that so-and-so is no longer with me? If both my parents passed away, do I still consider myself someone's daughter? The third kind of level of adjustment is spiritual. Often if it's a sudden death, a lot of people have a kind of a challenge in their belief system or might feel directionless. And so they might need some reorienting or regrounding in that realm. And then the fourth task is finding and enduring a connection with the loved one while embarking on, they call it a new life. So in my mind, this is the meaning making stage. And this is where you're making meaning of the loss, but also trying to incorporate it into this new chapter of your life. We want to try and find ways to remember the loved one and keep them with us and in a way form kind of a new relationship with them, but in a way that doesn't inhibit the changes that are necessary for us to move forward. So those are the four tasks, and I completely oversimplified it, and I know it's presented in task 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's important to know that it's not a linear process. It doesn't happen in a nice clear order. It can happen simultaneously. These tasks, you can start one, stop another, maybe revisit it, and it might recur again and again. So I don't want to, like I said, oversimplify it, but I think it is important to have this framework in mind as kind of a reference. So you might acknowledge where you are in a process or in a task and say, oh, this is this is what's going on with me right now, while you're in your personal journey. So we're going to talk about the different strategies and kind of coping skills that I mentioned a little later, but next I'm going to introduce Rabbi Lynn Liberman. She's our community chaplain at JFS.
Thank you, Sarah. And good evening, everybody. In thinking about what we have in Judaism, I've felt for so long have a real treasure of rituals and ways to help somebody who experiences the immediate loss and then the journey forward in the grief process with such beauty and profound ritual. And essentially what has happened in this, particularly in this time of COVID, of course, is that we have lost out on doing some of the rituals that are so profound for the reasons of safety and well-being. One of the first things that I say to a family when I encounter them to provide support at the time of funeral is to acknowledge that very first reality at the point of loss before the funeral, which is in Hebrew called aninut. It's an interesting thing. I sometimes translate this as the gray zone. Your loved one is no longer alive, but the rituals that we bring to bear that help us to sort of know what steps to take to journey forward through the grief process aren't available to us quite yet, because those happen with the funeral and subsequent to the funeral. So I was thinking about this gray zone. When I say this to families and individuals who have experienced the loss, they often nod with like, yeah, this is really weird. I can't pick up the phone and call my loved one anymore. I know I can't do that, but I so want to. It was like just yesterday I did that. And yet those things I know that are part of our Jewish tradition that are so helpful aren't quite there yet. I don't start saying the Kaddish prayer yet, right? And I don't have a ribbon to wear for the Kriya or the things going forward. That gray zone, I sometimes have thought in this time of COVID, seems to be bigger in a certain way. There's a fogginess to what happens when there's a loss. And we still carry through, and thankfully, and I'm going to go through and just recognize some of the rituals, we are still able to carry through a large number of them. But even with those, there are some that are missing. And the profound impact of Jewish ritual on our lives, for those who are Jewish and observant of the faith, is to help us make this journey happen in a way when sometimes it is cloudy. I sometimes feel that our rituals give us the safest place to be in a time when we are not so clear in our mind and so ready to have to make hard decisions. And so we envelop ourselves in these rituals to support us through this journey. So for those who've, if you've recently had a loss or can draw upon that point in time, and as well for those who are perhaps joining us tonight that haven't lost a loved one in this particular time relative to COVID, whether it was from the COVID itself or just in general. One of the things to say about that before I sort of enumerate and think through some of these rituals is that new losses, like what Sarah was teaching us about, actually bring up old familiar losses. So if you're feeling like, my loved one died a couple of years ago, I should be through this. Maybe not so much, right? If it's very present to you, it's very reasonable, very understandable. And Rabbi Davis is going to talk with us a little bit about the impact, especially in the calendar in just a few moments, about why that especially comes up perhaps at this time of the year. So, typically then in the Jewish world, we seek these rituals to do a few things for us. We seek to be grounded, to give us direction when we otherwise feel a little bit of, it's not normal time right now. So they give us connection to generations past. This is what has been done for years and thousands of years before us. And I'd like to think for generations after us. There's comfort in knowing that I'm part of the human plan, the human condition. The wisdom of our tradition brings that to us. There's strength in falling today the word is to lean into these moments and know that they're there to support you and to be there for you. And that's some of the beauty of a very ritually rich tradition such as Judaism. And there are other faiths too that have rituals that also provide that same support. And so the question is, what happens when they're altered? So just to name some of these, right? Typically, you would begin at the time of loss by contacting the rabbi or a funeral home to help arrange the ceremony. The first thing notably, and I'll say this just as a rabbi in the community, is that I don't get to sit in presence with the people with whom I am going to conduct their funeral. So you might feel that as well, right? The rabbi would say, what time can I show up at your house? And we're not able to, generally speaking, do that at this time. Maybe some people have been able to arrange that if it's been in the warm weather outside. But we don't get to physically be present to you and with you. That's a little loss, and as Sarah mentioned, there are these micro losses, these little losses that come along with the reality of the very big loss that you have experienced. And the impact is not, it makes a difference on us. So you sit sometimes with the rabbi over the phone. Perhaps it's a video conference, and I've done those too with families. This is what we sometimes call the intake process, just to learn about your loved one, to arrange for the ceremony, and make sure that you know what's going to happen next. Many funerals now, and there's a little bit of adjustment and change on this, but many funerals are done entirely via Zoom. What is that experience like when you are watching and participating full-heartedly, but you aren't physically present? And I kind of wonder, for people who go through that experience, and I've conducted these funerals as well, which when you're not there, how real does it feel? I'm going to just say a positive. I've conducted funerals, and people who otherwise could not attend have been able to attend. And that's been a very warm kind of side thing that maybe never was thought about before. But that great aunt or that person with another travel difficulty, or just the fact of timing, would not have been able to attend the funeral. They find connection and opportunity all of a sudden because they can at least Zoom in. And the same goes, as I'll mention again in a moment, the Shiva. That opportunity. Kriya, one of those very profound first rituals that we do at the service. I know that some people are showing up to the graveside, and some funerals are now happening at graveside, but otherwise a rabbi would be present, a funeral director would assist, and that ribbon that is the mark of the tearing away of this loved one is torn by the individual. Sometimes it's pinned on by, depending on the customs of your community, pinned on by the clergy person or by the funeral director. And again, as an individual, you're left to do that on your own. Tearing is an individual process, at least when I conduct a funeral, but that process is done on your own. Burial. So the rest of the funeral service can be the words that are shared, the words of our liturgy, the words of eulogy, of chesped. But we do have profound rituals, and that next one is burial. And again, if we're not able to be at graveside, one of the challenges to acknowledge is not only the loss of the profound sense of I'm definitely saying goodbye to my loved one, the act of this very generous act of chesed, of Kvurat HaMet, that we are not able to do. And there could very well be some thoughtfulness down the road of, did that person really leave my life? And one who's embedded in the Jewish world of rituals knows that there's the sound of the earth being placed onto a coffin is very profound and very memorable as a sign, as a marker. This person indeed has left us this physical presence. Leaving the cemetery. Tradition would be walking between two rows of people. So some of you maybe have experienced other funerals where that you've been those people. I often say that there are no words that can be expressed to the meaning of the moment. Just the fact that you are present speaks volumes. So it's kind of strange when we end funerals on Zoom now. They sort of just kind of end, but we don't have that formal way of that acknowledgement of the place and space that you are as a mourner. And of course, we're absent all the hugs, the handshakes, the warm arm around the shoulders, and those other feelings of support that are absent. The continuation of the rituals, just to mention those too. What happens when your family comes home? Meals, food is a strong part of our Jewish tradition, and eating after a funeral, not just to have a meal, but it actually has a particular role in saying to a family that life now will continue. It'll be changed, and we have foods that symbolically mark this, but generally, and a lot of custom is to have others with us. So I know that when I'm working with families, often we just don't even have a chance to really talk about that because it doesn't fit. We can't invite others. The Shiva service has been transferred in large part to this format of the Zoom video, and thank goodness again, I've attended several Shiva Minyanim where people from really around the globe have been able to come and be a part of that opportunity to share memories and to share support. And yet it's different, and to acknowledge that difference. The last thing I'll say at this point just about these Jewish rituals is that the length of time feels, I think, different. I go back to just the way I framed it in the beginning is the aninut. There's a grayness. Our rituals help us to mark time. So that's why we say in terms of mourning, Shiva for 7 days, Shloshim, 30 days, and then depending on what is next, generally speaking, the year of memory, the year of loss, and the purposeful attending of a Shiva minyan, of an opportunity to say the Kaddish prayer. These things feel somewhat absent because you physically don't tend to go somewhere to do these things where somebody might have with a minyan. But tuning in on a Shiva minyan or finding a congregation that is just having those regular services at which the Kaddish prayer can be said is a wonderful opportunity to continue to make the time purposeful and intentional. That Jewish wisdom is that we need at least, and I always say it this way, at least a year to confront all the times that would have been regular moments of engagement with this individual and all the regular things that would have happened, a birthday celebration, a holiday celebration, another time that you would have attended an event together. Those points are very poignant. And to have a chance to pass through those moments readies us for the following year as well. I'm grateful for this opportunity to give some thought to this important topic and to invite my colleague, Rabbi Alexander Davis, to share with us some insights for this period of time just before the High Holy Days. Somebody's asking a great question. What is happening in the Shomer experience? How is it done now? Yeah, really quickly, I can say that here in the Twin Cities, most of the funerals and the rituals are being done by Hadroffs with a Chevra Kadisha in a safe way. And in terms of Shmirah, those who are sitting Shomer, they are handling that as well. Other than those details, I'm not, maybe Rabbi Alexander Davis has a thought or two to share more on that. But thank you for the question. And he's a rabbi at Bethel Synagogue, so welcome, thank you.
Thank you so much, Erev Tov. Thank you to Jewish Family Services and all the many staff and partner organizations for being the place that we can turn to in these difficult times. I want to begin actually just by reiterating some of the things that we heard from Sarah and from Rabbi Lieberman. This program is called This Loss is Different, and it is. The things that we're experiencing now as a society are new to all of us. They're unfamiliar and sometimes unexpected. And so I think we can give ourselves permission and give ourselves forgiveness to feel exactly as we might feel: scared, alone, stressed, confused. At the same time, I want to remind all of us that all loss is personal and every loss is unique and every loss is different. In that sense, we should avoid comparing ourselves, how this loss feels, to a previous loss or to someone else's loss. We don't have to justify ourselves or anyone else that this is different. We simply have to acknowledge this is real and I'm hurting. With all of that said, we are blessed, as Rabbi Lieberman said, to have a Jewish tradition to turn to and rely on, and to have each other and sacred communities to turn to and to rely on. Jewish tradition provides wisdom and a lens through which we can reflect on our lives, on our losses, and it provides practices that help us journey, as we say, through the valley of the shadow of death. And as we're approaching the High Holy Days, that's really a perfect opportunity to use these holidays as a lens to think about the loss that we have and are experiencing. Now, oftentimes we think about the High Holidays and we think about a celebration. We talk about a birthday of the world, and we may think of it as a time for family. It's a time for eating apples and honey and sweet honey cake. It's a chance for renewal. And so that would seem to fly in the face all of this upbeat theme of the loss that we feel. But actually, the Yamim Noraim, these high holy days, are in a way frightful days. They are frightful because they would have us confront our own vulnerability. They have us look inward and see that raw place of loss and pain. We may think of that in association with Yizkor on Yom Kippur, when we literally name the people in our lives who have died. We see it in other places as well. In our Rosh Hashanah Torah reading, that tells the story of barrenness, of women whose dreams for motherhood have gone unrealized. We see that in prayers like Unatana Tokef that challenge us to admit that we're not in control, that we're nothing but dust, a passing shadow, a fading flower, a fleeting breeze. Think about loss through the lens of the High Holidays. There is one ritual and one tradition and moment that I think places it most prominently and powerfully in the center. And that is with the shofar. The shofar, we usually think about as used to announce the beginning of a new year. It's the sound of revelation on Mount Sinai, the sound of the coronation of the Melech, of God as king, so to speak. But it's also the sound of pain. It's the cry of mourning. Now, there's much to say about the shofar. We can even talk about its very shape. They say that the shofar is bent to remind us of how in pain and in grief we are literally bent over. We feel burdened. Or perhaps the shofar is that which lifts up, it's reaching up with hopefulness to the heavens. The shofar begins in a place of narrowness. And oftentimes when we're in mourning, we feel life kind of constricted and confined around us. But it ends in a place of broadness, that sense, mina meitzar, that we move, God willing, through the valley of the shadow of death from a place of narrowness to a place of broadness. But I'd really like to focus for a moment on the sounds of the shofar, because it's in them where I think we can understand this message of how we move and move through grief. So in the Torah, it says that Rosh Hashanah is to be a Yom Truah, a day of blowing the horn. Utkatem Truah, we're told. But the Torah doesn't actually tell us, what does this sound like? It's not clear what the word Truah means. And so in wonderful rabbinic fashion, the rabbis debate this word Truah. Some say that it sounds like weeping, and some say that it sounds like moaning. And in good rabbinic fashion, they say, you're right, and you're right. All opinions are included. And so we have this memorable pattern that repeats time after time throughout Rosh Hashanah, of a whole note, followed by a broken note, followed by another whole note. The whole notes, we start out from this place of wholeness. Along the way, we are wounded and broken, and we cry out in pain, and then we move towards wholeness again. That really is the spiral of life. But I'd like us to pause on each of those notes and really understand how they work. So the rabbis teach that the first note is called pshuta, and I'd like to demonstrate that for you. It's a simple note. The word in other words, this note is reminding us, indicating us that we thought that we knew how the world worked. We thought that we knew that there were tragedies. We knew that there was loss. We had a sense of how things worked. We knew how death worked. We saw our loved ones at their bedside. We said goodbye to them there. We went to the funeral. We felt comforted by Shiva. And of course, none of that could happen. This first Pshuta, this simple blast, it reminds us of that time of innocence, that time when we felt like we understood. But in a way, it was a limited understanding of now that we see the true complexities of the world. It was broken by Shvarim. These next notes are the broken notes. With Shvarim, our innocence is broken. And with it, we're broken too. We're broken into pieces by a loss. Next is Trua, which is referred to as a sound of weeping or of tears. It's almost like you can't catch your breath. You're so in pain. There are many tears on Rosh Hashanah. Hannah, a woman that we read about, weeps for her child, and Rachel, weeps for her children going into exile. So we moved from that place of innocence to a place of loss, to feeling so shattered and so bereft. But significantly, the shofar ends with another pshuta shel arita, another long note. A whole note. But this time something has changed because we've acknowledged our anguish and our tears. We affirm the need to carry on with courage and confidence. The simple note afterwards marks the bravery of keeping going. Perhaps that's why the final sound of the entire sequence is the Tkiya Gdola, the great, long, drawn out, but simple note. It's full of strength. It represents the sustained effort of resilience and courage. Finally, let me remind you about the shofar, that in addition to the notes, the blessing that we say is significant. We say, Lishmoa kol shofar. We're called upon to hear the shofar. We're called upon to listen to the brokenness of ourselves on the inside, not to stuff it away and ignore it, but truly to listen, but also to listen for the pain of others. Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, in his book, The Eternal Journey, Meditations on the Jewish Year, kind of brings together these various themes of the shofar as he writes, what then is the difference between the simple note before and the simple note after? Experience, understanding, courage, wisdom, and if possible, the gift of laughing at ourselves. The story of the shofar is an account of the development of the human heart. In life, this story is probably not sequential. The different notes and moods often coincide, and even a day may well contain all of them. But if there were no simple notes at the beginning, if there was no pain, and if there was no plain, innocent joy, would life really be worth living? If we felt no brokenness, no empathy with suffering, would we truly be human? If our heart were incapable of weeping, could we feel close to another? Could we really love? And if there were no simple note afterwards, how, with all the burden of distress to which we are constantly exposed, could any of us keep going? In a full life, in a good life, all the notes are sounded. Finally, one last teaching about the shofar I'll share with you. The seer of Lublin, the Chozeh of Lublin, says that this word trua, which means blast, in a wordplay, he says it's related to the word reut, which means friendship. It's a statement that we best repair the brokenness in our lives and in the world by combining hands and hearts with each other in personal friendships, in loving kinship with humanity. The shofar gives us permission to give voice to our brokenness and to know wholeness. We might be tempted to put our anguish off into a corner and lock it up, but sometimes the best way to acknowledge it is to name it, to give voice with words or simply with a cry. With your permission, I'll just take another moment to share just a few more ideas about tools we can offer both during this time of year and throughout the year to offer ourselves comfort in a time of loss. One, as Rabbi Lieberman mentioned, is attending high holiday services. Almost all the synagogues are having virtual services, and for the most part, they're free, they're accessible, just contacting an office in advance, and you are more than welcome to come. One thing that we might do now is to look ahead and plan for a post-pandemic opportunity to come together, to really grieve together, for a memorial, for a chance to have kind of a Shiva that's been extended out past the 7 days or the 30 days, even into the year, to maybe use the opportunity of an unveiling when we can be together to feel that sense of comfort that we might have missed out on earlier. If there was not a Shiva, there nevertheless can be the opportunity to take that time to pause, to spend time daily to recite the Kaddish, or to carve out time each day to remember our loved ones, whether that's by looking at pictures, by studying sacred texts, by speaking with a relative and sharing stories. Of course, as I mentioned, Jewish family services, Jewish family children's services, your rabbis and cantors and counselors and grief support groups, we're all here for you. And finally, this is a wonderful time, the beginning of a new year, and in the face of loss, to begin a Jewish spiritual practice by turning to Jewish traditions and really taking them on as your own. One that I think about now is reciting words of a psalm. Psalm is just a fancy way of saying a poem. And Psalm 27 has words that I think speak directly to those facing grief. So you could read the whole psalm. You could choose just a focus phrase. You could learn a tune to that psalm and have it in your back pocket and pull it out and sing it to yourself, hum it to yourself, give yourself strength. I'd like to conclude sharing with you a reflection on one word in Psalm 27. Psalm 27 concludes, Kaveh el Adonai chazak ve'emes libecha. Hope in Adonai, be strong, take courage and hope in Adonai. A wonderful phrase to carry with you, a hopeful message that we can be strong. And Rabbi Deborah Robbins, in a just really beautiful, powerful new book called Opening Your Heart with Psalm 27, offers a reflection for each of the verses and almost each of the words in this psalm. She highlights the word chazak, which means strength. Strength is when I'm not defined only by a death, an accident, addictive behavior, a terrible mistake, a relationship that failed, a darkened dream. I was strong once, maybe twice. It was a long time ago, or maybe it was yesterday. Now I need to be strong. I want to be strong. I can be strong. I can teach my grief, my pain, my doubt, my guilt, my heartache, my defeat. I can teach them to smile. Teaching grief to smile is a lifelong job because I learned differently at different stages of life. I was strong as a child facing the death of my mother. I was strong when I became a mother without my mother. I was strong comforting a mother whose child died, a child whose mother died. I teach grief the same way I teach anything, with patience, vulnerability, creativity, in relationship. Good teaching transforms the teacher, the student, even the world. In each encounter is an opportunity to strengthen myself and others, with others. I am strong when I'm not alone, and always learning to teach my grief to smile.
Okay, I think it's back to me. Thank you, Rabbi. I am just going to speak briefly about kind of that concept of how do we go from brokenness back to wholeness, and to kind of leave you with some ideas and thoughts on how to cope with the loss. In my mind, the best or most helpful way to think about how to grieve in a healthy way is to think about how our body responds when it has a wound or some kind of injury. And our bodies are built to heal wounds with bleeding, and if it's ignored, it will become infected. And so similarly, I think our bodies are built to deal with a loss, but it needs to be tended to and nurtured, and if ignored, it can get worse. And so I'm going to again oversimplify because this process is incredibly hard, and it takes a lot of time. But I think that there are two things to always keep in mind, two goals to work towards, is to take care of yourself and to let others take care of you. For taking care of yourself, again, this is with the concept of grief being like a wound. I think of how we have to go through rehab after surgery, and it's a painful process, but it's an absolutely needed process in the steps of recovery. So you want to try to avoid things that are going to mask the pain. So distractions, substance use, busying yourself, they aren't going to serve you well in the long run. And you want to focus on your basic needs, staying safe, which right now is on all of our minds. You want to focus on eating well, trying to get good sleep, finding some small routines, and having some frequent mental health check-ins with yourself. Check in to see how you're doing. I mentioned this briefly before, but this is a good time to limit your exposure to the news. Try to keep it to a bare minimum, just enough to feel like you can be informed of what's going on. You really want to stay gentle with yourself and be kind to yourself. I've said this a lot, just speaking to folks about coping with COVID, that nobody can be their best self right now. It's just impossible given all the challenges that we're facing. And that is no more true when you're grieving. It's impossible to do. So you need to be kind to yourself and to avoid self-criticism. You know, stay away from the I should do this, or I shouldn't be doing that, I should be feeling this way, I shouldn't be feeling that way. And instead focus on what's working for you. Focus on what strengths you have. Focus on what coping skills have helped you in the past get through difficult times. It's going to look different, but you might be surprised how some things might pop up and be helpful. One approach that I think is helpful is to alternate between what's considered loss activities and restorative activities. So the loss activities are ways that you express your grief. So talking to someone, crying, looking at photos, naming the losses, and that's especially important with the non-death losses or the micro losses and the big losses. Try to use art or music, writing, some creative ways to as an outlet or a way to express your grief. To create a memorial or a ritual for your loved one, or try visiting a place or do an activity that your loved one liked to do as a way of kind of being with them in a way. Then the restorative activities are things like exercise, getting good sleep, eating well, and maybe making plans for the future, which is hard right now, but if there are ways that you can make some plans or engage in hobbies, maybe even start new hobbies and to try to connect with others. If you can try and alternate between these two, it will help through the process. And then the other piece, to be cared for by others. And you want to allow yourself to be cared for both in a practical and an emotional sense. So let people know what helps. If it's bringing food or making appointments, going for walks. We've touched a lot on how that is looking different with COVID and all the restrictions, but if there are ways to connect, it will certainly be helpful. Grief is a very isolating time, and anything you can do to try and connect at least to one person or even a select few people is helpful. A suggestion is to schedule in a conversation into your weekly schedule with people. Even though it feels like an appointment, it's a way to keep you connected. And then to find others who understand. So it's helpful to connect with other people that are experiencing the loss of the same person, to share memories, to share photos, stories, letters, and just connect around that love. Certainly finding support groups can be helpful, and as mentioned before, grief counselors, therapists, and any of the resources that we've been mentioning. We're going to send out a resource list after this event, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us at JFS or any of the other event sponsors tonight if there's anything that we can do to help in your process. I think we are going to, open it up. Chris, maybe you can help us with this next part.
Chris, we can't hear you.
Try canceling the spotlight.
Did that make a difference? Okay, yeah. Okay, so I think I tried to unmute everyone so that if anybody, nope, and that's not working. So I think I'm going to ask Miriam if she can maybe unmute everybody. Actually there, I think I just allowed everybody to unmute themselves. So if you have a question and would like to unmute yourself to ask that question. It looks like a few people have unmuted. So I don't know if anybody wants to ask a question. No, okay, let's continue then. Before I introduce Hazan, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what's going to happen at the end. We are going to have some music, and at that time you'll have an opportunity to, as you hover over the chat at the bottom, again, you'll be able to bring up your chat screen, and we invite you during the music to type in the name of someone that you'd like to be remembered, a loss that you've experienced, and it doesn't necessarily have to be this year, but we want people to have an opportunity to just share publicly in as close to a group environment as possible, the names of loved ones who maybe you haven't been able to share that loss with others in the public so far this year. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Hazan Joanna Dalkin, who is the Hazan at Adathya Sharoon congregation. And go ahead, Joanna.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for all your incredible teachings tonight. It's just so incredibly comforting to hear just the richness of our tradition and how useful and adaptable it is, no matter what we're going through. And so I'm here tonight to help to introduce some music that is going to take us out. And for me, I'm part of team music, obviously, as a cantor, but I will say that part of one's coping in this time with loss and trauma, one incredibly healing act is to listen to music. And especially on the Zoom format, when we're not able to have the freewheeling conversation in person or the hugs or sort of the tactile rituals, we do still have the ability to let ourselves be moved by music. As imperfect as it is to be listening to music over Zoom, I'm going to provide you with the links to both of the songs tonight so you can listen to them not through a Zoom. It might be a little bit easier to hear. But in the same way that Sarah was teaching about that we have to tend to our wounds, one of those ways we can tend to our wounds is to find a piece of music that speaks to our feelings, because music is what feelings sound like. So to find that piece of music that we find comforting in this moment, and there's so much beautiful stuff out there, to find it and to hold on to it in the same way that we hold on to anything that's meaningful to us, and I invite you to use this music as a way to work through and move through all the things that we're moving through. And so in a moment, we'll have time to enter the names into the chat. And the song you're going to be seeing is what the kids call a mashup. It's two songs that do not ordinarily go together, that I think go together quite beautifully. And the message of both is a message a little bit like what Rabbi Davis was saying, a little bit of a message of be strong. We're not alone. We're not going through this. We might be going through this physically alone, but we are not emotionally alone. And takes a little bit from actually many of the teachings this evening, this idea that we may miss the physical trappings of a sanctuary or a cemetery or a beloved one's home. We may miss those physical spaces and those physical trappings, and so it makes it difficult for us to really dial into our feelings. But we should know that despite this isolation, that we are all in this moment together and we're not alone. And when you feel perhaps those fleeting or maybe not so fleeting moments that you think you're the only one and that you feel lost to the community, maybe you don't feel seen, maybe you don't feel heard, the message from this song, so powerfully expressed by the cast of, originally by the cast of Dear Evan Hansen, a Broadway show, the chorus is that you will be found. You will be found no matter where you are, no matter what state you're in. You're not lost. And the words from Stephen Sondheim's show, Into the Woods, remind us you are not alone. Someone is on your side. Surround yourself with the people that are on your side, however we can surround ourselves, because we are not alone.
you. Now you're on your own. Only me beside you. Still, you're not alone. No one is alone, truly. No one is alone. Have you ever felt like nobody was there? Have you ever felt forgotten in the middle of nowhere? Have you ever felt like you could disappear? Like you could fall, no one would hear? So let that lonely feeling wash away. Maybe there's a reason to believe you'll be okay. 'Cause when you don't feel strong enough to stand, you can reach out your hand. And know someone will come running, and I know they'll take you home. Even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, when you're broken on the ground, you will be found. So let the sun come streaming in. You'll reach up, you'll rise again. Lift your head and look around. You will be found. You will be found. No one is alone. You will be found. No one is alone. You will be found. No one is alone. Someone is on your side. Someone else is not. While we're seeing our side, maybe we forgot we are not alone. No one is alone. Hard to see the light now. Just don't let it go. Things will turn out right now. We can make it so. Someone is on your side. No one is alone.
May the memories of all those who are in your hearts be treasured and be a source of love and comfort in these days and years ahead. We thank you for joining us together tonight in this small community of memory, and wish you in the days ahead finding peace in the new year amongst family and friends and others in our Jewish community. Laila Tov, good night.